The desert wind carried a chill that neither sun nor fire could chase, and Rowena felt it gnawing at the edges of her courage. She stumbled along the narrow canyon path, the hem of her once elegant, now faded dress brushing against jagged stones, lace gloves tucked into her waistband catching on stray branches. Her messy blonde braid hung over one shoulder, loose strands sticking to the sweat and dust of the road. One shoulder was bare, the corset slightly loosened, and she hugged herself instinctively, wishing she could vanish. Lozin had been following her for hours. He moved like a shadow among the rocks, silent and deliberate, feathers braided into his shoulder-length dark hair swaying with each step. Slender but muscular, dressed in deerskin trousers with a red woven belt, he had the kind of presence that made the ground itself seem to shift. Rowena didn't want to notice him, didn't want to feel the pull that his silent gaze seemed to exert across the canyon floor. And yet, despite her protests, despite the fear twisting her chest, there was something magnetic in the way he moved, careful, yet utterly impossible to ignore. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice cracking more from terror than anger. She spun to face him, hands raised as if she could physically shove away the quiet storm that was Lozin. He stopped. Not a step closer, not a gesture of threat. He simply tilted his head, dark eyes locked on hers, calm and unyielding, and in the pause that followed, Rowena felt her resolve wobble. There was a power in him that didn't shout or strike. It just existed. Heavy, unmovable. The wind tugged at her hair and the folds of her dress, whispering against the canyon walls. Lozin's lips pressed into a line, and he inclined his head toward a narrow ledge above the path, indicating the safest way forward. Rowena's chest heaved. She wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but the canyon walls hemmed her in. With a deep, reluctant exhale, she nodded, gripping the folds of her dress, every muscle taut with tension. They moved in silence, side by side, the gap between them full of unspoken words. Each step was a negotiation of distance. How close was too close? How far was safe? Rowena's pulse raced, not just from the treacherous path, but from the constant, silent awareness of Lozin's presence. He was everywhere, and nowhere at once. The smell of leather and earth clinging to him, the rhythm of his movement mirrored her own. At a sudden narrowing of the path, Rowena slipped. Her gloved hand scrabbled at the loose rocks, and her body tipped dangerously toward the canyon's edge. Before she could scream, strong hands caught her by the waist. "Careful," Lozin murmured, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of authority and attention in equal measure. Rowena's eyes widened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She jerked back reflexively, instinct demanding distance, but the hold was gentle, precise, unyielding in a way that made her body betray her. "You, let go," she demanded, cheeks burning. But the tone that left her lips was frayed, uncertain. He didn't release her. Instead, his grip adjusted, steadying her, his presence closer than she wanted. Rowena could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the quiet, restrained force that held her upright and safe. She swallowed hard, eyes darting away, yet she couldn't escape the tension coiling in her chest, a mixture of relief, fear, and something else she refused to name. As they continued along the cliffside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Dust rose in lazy swirls around their feet, catching the last rays of light, making everything shimmer in gold and amber. Lozin's dark silhouette moved like a shadow tethered to her, constant and unflinching. Rowena stumbled again, and he caught her just in time. Their hands brushed, hers trembling, his steady, and the contact sparked an almost electric awareness, leaving her breathless. She jerked her hand back, glaring at him with indignation. "Are you going to follow me all the way?" she demanded, voice sharper than she felt. "I will go where you go," he said simply, tone devoid of judgment or mockery. Calm, certain, unshakable. Her chest tightened. It was infuriating, maddening, and yet necessary. Her mind rebelled, telling her to flee, to push him away, to remind herself that he was dangerous, untouchable, untamed, and utterly unpredictable. And still, a part of her, buried deep beneath fear and stubbornness, recognized that she might never want to escape him entirely. By the time night fell, the canyon narrowed to a rocky cleft where they were forced to stop. Rowena set down her makeshift bundle of supplies, breathing heavily, trying to regain control. Lozin remained a few paces behind, eyes scanning the cliffs, silent as ever. His hands were empty, relaxed, but his presence was a physical weight she couldn't shrug off. "You need rest," he said, voice low, not commanding, just stating the fact. "I don't need anything from you," she replied sharply, though her knees threatened to buckle with exhaustion. He nodded once, and that was all. No argument, no insistence, and yet, as Rowena settled herself against a jagged boulder, she felt the gap between them shrink imperceptibly. The canyon was dark now, stars faintly pricking the sky, and the night air was crisp. Lozin crouched nearby, his dark hair catching the faint starlight, feathers braided in, the red woven belt standing out against his deerskin trousers. He was quiet, alert, and somehow impossibly close, even without moving. Rowena pulled her cloak tighter, glancing at him through the corner of her eye. He didn't look at her directly, yet she felt the weight of his gaze. Every muscle in her body remained tense, ready to flee, ready to fight. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange calm settling over her. The storm in her chest was still there, raging, but somewhere beneath it was a recognition. This man, Lozin, was not like anyone she had ever known. And he was now, somehow, bound to her path. For the first time, Rowena wondered if the danger was truly from him, or if the threat came from the feelings she couldn't yet name. The night stretched on in the canyon like a living thing, heavy with silence and the whisper of wind through jagged rocks. Rowena tried to sleep sitting against the boulder, her back stiff, one shoulder exposed, hair loose and messy around her face. The faded elegance of her dress offered little comfort. The corset was loosened, yet still binding her, a subtle reminder of the life she had left behind. Lace gloves tucked in her waistband brushed against her fingers with every shift, a small connection to civility in a world that was anything but. Lozin sat nearby, his eyes scanning the dark crevices of the canyon. Dark short hair braided with feathers caught the faint starlight, a shadow of his silent presence. Slender but muscular, wearing deerskin trousers and the red woven belt that marked him as Apache, he exuded a calm control that unnerved and fascinated her in equal measure. Every so often a rock clattered somewhere down the path, and he was instantly alert, yet never so much as a hand reached for a weapon. He only watched, breathing in rhythm with the canyon. Hours passed. Rowena's thoughts raced. She hated how aware she was of him. The brush of his presence made her pulse race, and yet she hated herself for it. Why did she care? Why did a man she barely knew, who could have left her to the mercies of the canyon, have such a claim over her focus? Her hands twisted in her lap, braid slipping from her shoulder, as her mind wrestled with the tension coiling tight inside her chest. By the first hint of dawn, the wind carried a sharp bite, and Rowena shivered. Lozin rose silently, moving to stand beside her. She didn't ask for help, didn't want it. Yet the heat of his body so close made her shiver for reasons unrelated to cold. "Water," he said simply, nodding toward the small stream they had passed earlier. His voice was low, almost neutral, but there was weight in it that demanded attention. Rowena shook her head, fingers tightening on the folds of her dress. "I can manage," she said, though the protest was weak. She glanced at him sideways, noting how effortlessly he seemed to inhabit the canyon, how natural he looked in the wilderness that had left her on edge since day one. He didn't insist. Instead, he waited, shadowing her movement, silent and watchful, and when she stumbled again, a sharp gasp escaping her, his hands were there in a flash, not pressing or aggressive, just holding, steadying, correcting. She jerked back instinctively, heart hammering, cheeks burning. The canyon air did nothing to cool the heat pooling in her chest. "You," she started, voice trembling between indignation and something else she couldn't name. "You always have to. I keep you safe," he interrupted, voice calm, authoritative, but without harshness. "That is all." Her gaze snapped to his, and for a moment, the canyon seemed to shrink, folding them into a narrow space where nothing existed but his dark eyes, and the braided feathers in his hair, the red woven belt at his waist, and the muscles of his arms holding her upright. She swallowed hard, jaw tightening. There was anger there, yes, but something more buried beneath it. Something that made her blood burn despite her determination to remain distant. They moved onward, the rising sun casting streaks of gold across rocks and desert dust. Rowena found herself adjusting the folds of her faded dress, brushing the lace gloves against her fingertips, every movement exaggeratedly careful. Lozen's presence was always at the edge of her awareness, a silent gravity pulling at her attention. She hated it. She hated him, and yet there was a part of her that wanted to notice him, wanted to feel the tension that thickened every shared glance. Around mid-morning, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a canyon split by a rushing river far below. Rowena froze, hands gripping rocks as the edge threatened to betray her balance. Lozen was instantly at her side, catching her elbow, his touch firm but careful, muscles flexing under the deerskin trousers and red belt. She jerked back, eyes flashing. "Lozen, Shh," he said softly, and for the first time, his lips moved in a way that carried a weight beyond words. The sound wasn't loud, wasn't intimate, yet it commanded attention. Rowena's chest constricted. The canyon walls echoed with the rush of water far below. The wind tugged at her hair and dress. But in that instant, all else faded. His hand was steady on her elbow. Her heart was anything but. They spent the morning navigating the treacherous ledge. Silence stretched tight between them. Every time Rowena faltered, every time a loose rock shifted underfoot, Lozen was there. Not for dominance, not for command, but for presence. And every time he steadied her, every accidental brush of hands, every glance that lingered too long, she felt the tension coil tighter, unspoken, undeniable, and maddeningly adult. By midday, the canyon opened into a small plateau, dotted with scrub and wildflowers. Rowena sank onto a flat stone, dusting her dress as best she could, braid loose and messy, one shoulder exposed. Lozen remained standing a few paces away, dark hair catching in the sun, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt visible in the light. He didn't sit, didn't approach, yet the space between them was charged, as if the air itself had thickened. Rowena's hands fidgeted with her lace gloves, curling and uncurling them in her lap. She looked away, toward the horizon, the canyon stretching endlessly, thinking of anything but him, but the knowledge of his presence was inescapable. Each shadow, each shift of light, reminded her that he was there, silent and steady. And somewhere deep in her chest, the realization took root. She could not fully escape him. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The afternoon passed in careful steps, tension stretching taut between them. They set up a small camp, Rowena doing as much as she could while keeping a careful distance. Lozen's hands never touched her, but his presence was magnetic, unyielding, and with every glance, every subtle motion, every time he stood just close enough to influence her balance or safety, the canyon seemed to shrink, isolating them in a private world where restraint and desire hung thick in the air. Night fell again, the stars sharp and cold. Rowena sat by the small fire, braid falling over her shoulder, corset loosened, dress faded and wrinkled from the day's trek. Lozen crouched a short distance away, dark hair brushing his shoulders, feathers braided in, the red woven belt gleaming faintly. He said nothing, yet Rowena felt him, felt the pull, the presence, the quiet intensity. A gust of wind swept over the plateau, tugging at her dress and hair. She hugged herself, wishing for solitude, wishing for the canyon to swallow her whole. Lozen didn't move closer. He didn't have to. His watchful posture, the sheer gravity of him, the slow, deliberate calm of his stance. It was enough to leave her restless, aware, and full of unspoken questions. By the time she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Rowena knew two things with certainty. She could not shake Lozen. She did not want to. The sun had barely risen, spilling gold across the desert canyon. Yet Rowena was already awake. Her back ached from sleeping on jagged rocks, the loose braid of her blonde hair slipping over one shoulder, and her faded, once elegant dress creased from the night's restless movements. The corset was slightly loosened, allowing her the smallest measure of comfort, and her lace gloves tucked into her waistband brushed against her fingers as she flexed her hands. One shoulder remained exposed, the chill of the morning air biting at her skin. She shivered and hugged herself, unwilling to admit that the presence of Lozan nearby did nothing to ease her tension. Lozan had been awake longer. He sat a short distance away, dark short hair brushing his shoulders with feathers braided in, muscular frame taut and alert, deerskin trousers and red woven belt standing out in the morning light. His eyes traced the canyon edges, watching for any movement, his posture calm but precise. Rowena tried to ignore him, but the subtle, unyielding energy radiating from him made it impossible. The morning air was thin and dry. Rowena wrapped her arms around her chest, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her like the dust on her dress. Lozan moved closer, deliberately quiet, and crouched on a flat rock nearby. She caught sight of his gaze sweeping the path ahead, ever vigilant. She looked away, pretending to be absorbed in the sparse desert flowers, but she felt the pull, that unspoken force between them that she could neither name nor resist. "You should drink some water," he said quietly, voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Not a command, not a plea, just a statement, simple and unyielding. Rowena's hands twitched at her sides. "I can manage," she replied sharply, not trusting her own voice to remain steady. She wanted to show him that she was independent, capable. Yet the desert was harsh, the path ahead treacherous, and every instinct screamed at her to accept his presence, his guidance, whether she admitted it or not. The journey resumed. Dust swirled at their feet, scraping against the faded folds of her dress. Her braid swung against her shoulder with every step, one bare shoulder catching the wind. Lozan followed silently, muscles flexing as he navigated the uneven terrain. Every so often, her fingers brushed his sleeve, or the hem of her dress caught briefly on his arm as he steadied her on the rocks. She jerked back each time, cheeks burning, but the tension between them only tightened. They came to a narrow ridge overlooking a dry canyon riverbed. Loose stones threatened her footing, and Rowena froze. Lozan was instantly beside her, hand brushing hers as he steadied her. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear and frustration, his calm and certain. "Lozan, she started, breath uneven, heart hammering. "Shh," he said softly, voice carrying a weight that silenced the canyon itself. She couldn't move, couldn't think past the sudden closeness. His hand on hers was firm but gentle, the touch lingering just long enough to make her pulse spike. Her fingers curled instinctively into her gloves, and she turned her gaze away, heat rising to her cheeks. The canyon seemed to narrow, shadows and sunlight dancing over the dust, the scrub, the jagged edges of rock, all framing this quiet, charged moment. They moved along the ridge in silence. Rowena's mind raced with thoughts she didn't dare voice. She hated him, yes, or thought she did. Yet every glance, every subtle movement, made her feel something entirely new and confusing. She hated the pull, hated herself for noticing it, hated the way her chest tightened whenever he was near. Around midday, the canyon widened into a sun-scorched plateau dotted with stones and scrub. Rowena sank onto a flat rock, dusting her dress as best she could, braid loose and messy over her shoulder. One shoulder exposed, corset slightly loosened, gloves in her waistband. She was a picture of disheveled composure. Lozan remained standing a few paces away, posture calm, dark braided hair catching the sun, deerskin trousers and red woven belt stark against the pale earth. He didn't sit, didn't approach, but the distance between them pulsed with tension, as if the very air had thickened. Rowena's fingers toyed with the lace gloves in her waistband, curling and uncurling them as she stared toward the horizon. The canyon stretched endlessly, but her focus was on him, on the space he occupied, on the calm, commanding way he moved. Every detail, the feathers braided into his dark hair, the muscular tension in his arms, the way his eyes followed her without a word, filled her chest with an awareness that was at once maddening and intoxicating. The afternoon passed slowly. They set up a small camp, Rowena moving cautiously, avoiding unnecessary contact. yet she could feel his presence at the edge of every glance. When she bent to gather some firewood, she felt the shadow of him behind her, muscles taut, watching, protective. Her heart thundered and she straightened quickly, trying to disguise the heat creeping up her neck and into her cheeks. When the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the plateau, Rowena sat by the fire. Braid falling over her shoulder, one bare shoulder catching the fading light, dress dusty and faded, corset loosened. She felt exposed, vulnerable, aware of Lozin even as he remained just out of reach. He crouched nearby, dark hair catching the last rays, feathers braided in, muscles relaxed yet ready, deerskin trousers and red woven belt gleaming faintly. The fire crackled between them, tension unspoken yet palpable. Every flicker of light cast their shadows against the rocks, exaggerating the distance between them even as it drew them closer. Rowena hugged herself, feeling the heat of the flames and the weight of his presence in equal measure. A gust of wind lifted her braid, brushing her bare shoulder. Lozin's eyes followed the motion, calm and deliberate. She couldn't look directly at him, yet she knew he saw every detail. The way she shifted, the way her hands clenched her dress, the tightness of her chest. And she felt, for the first time, the undeniable pull of the tension they carried between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was something older, rawer, a tether she could not sever. As night fell and the stars pricked the sky, Rowena lay back against her rock, closing her eyes. Lozin remained vigilant nearby, silent and watchful. The canyon was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the whispering wind. She did not sleep easily, for even in the darkness she could feel him, could feel the impossible closeness that made her pulse race. And somewhere deep inside, she admitted a truth she would not speak aloud. She was drawn to him, pulled into a storm of feeling she could neither name nor resist. The morning sun rose like molten gold over the canyon, casting long shadows that stretched across the rocky plateau. Rowena stirred from her restless sleep, braid falling over one shoulder, faded dress rumpled from the night, corset slightly loosened, lace gloves tucked in her waistband, shoulder exposed to the crisp air. The wind tugged at her hair, brushing against her cheek, and she shivered, tugging her arms around her body. Lozin was already moving, stepping lightly over the stones, dark short hair catching the light, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt prominent against the desert tones. His eyes scanned the canyon, alert and unyielding, every movement precise and deliberate. Even the morning air seemed to follow him, heavy with the quiet intensity he carried. Rowena rose, brushing dust from her dress, and followed him at a careful distance. Her heart thumped in her chest as the canyon opened before them, the path narrowing again. Each step was a careful negotiation of space, the pull of his presence inescapable. She hated how aware she was of him, of the heat of his body just behind her, of the silent force he radiated, and yet she couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard she tried. They reached a small ridge that overlooked a dry riverbed, sunlight glinting off the rocks and water below. The canyon's edge was treacherous, and Rowena froze, hand gripping a jagged stone. Lozin appeared at her side in an instant, his hand brushing hers as he steadied her. The contact was brief, subtle, yet charged, and she jerked back instinctively. "Careful," he said, voice low and calm, eyes locked on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The canyon seemed to shrink around them, the rocks and sunlight fading into the background as the tension between them pulsed. Undeniable. Rowena wanted to protest, wanted to push him away, but the warmth of his hand lingering near hers made her pulse spike, and she found herself silent. The canyon stretched before them, empty save for the two of them. Yet every glance, every shift of balance, drew them closer in ways neither admitted. They continued along the ridge in a fragile silence. The desert stretched endlessly, scrub and stones dotting the plateau, the wind tugging at Rowena's braid and the edge of her dress. Lozin moved with the grace and assurance of a predator and a protector in one, every motion measured, every step deliberate. She caught herself staring at him once, and immediately looked away, cheeks burning. By midday, they reached a small alcove in the rocks, where a shallow pool reflected the sun. Rowena set down her bundle, dusting her dress as best she could. Lozen crouched a few paces away, scanning the edges of the canyon with that calm, unyielding focus. The distance between them was a taut line of energy, a storm of unspoken words and restrained impulses. She wanted to speak, wanted to demand space, yet her body betrayed her, trembling slightly from the exertion and the pull of his presence. He did not move closer, but the gravity of him filled the space, and she felt the tension coil tight, knotting her chest. The afternoon passed in careful observation of the canyon. Every time Rowena bent to adjust her dress or braid, every time her hand brushed against the dust or stone, Lozen's eyes followed. His dark hair, braided feathers, and red woven belt marked him as Apache, his muscular frame ever present, silent but commanding. And though he never touched her again in that day, the proximity, the weight of his gaze, the subtle sway of his movement was enough to leave her breathless. Nightfall brought a clear sky, stars sharp against the blackness. Rowena wrapped herself in her cloak, braid loose, shoulder exposed, dress dusty and faded. Lozen crouched nearby, still watchful, dark hair catching the faint starlight, red woven belt vivid against the muted tones of the plateau. The firelight flickered between them, shadows dancing across their figures. The canyon was silent, save for the crackling flames and the whisper of wind. Rowena felt the pull again, that unspoken, charged awareness of him near. She hugged herself, shivering, but it wasn't entirely from the cold. Lozen's gaze rested on her periodically, steady and unwavering, and she felt the strange mix of fear, tension, and something else she refused to name. Somewhere deep inside, she admitted quietly to herself that she was drawn to him, bound by a force she couldn't control. It was not love, not yet, but the spark of something older, stronger, and impossible to ignore. And for the first time, she wondered if the danger was truly outside in the canyon, or if it was this force between them that she could neither deny nor escape. The sun had dipped low, bleeding orange and crimson across the canyon walls, and the desert plateau glowed with the final warmth of day. Rowena shifted on a flat rock, braid loose over her shoulder, faded dress wrinkled from hours of travel, corset slightly loosened, lace gloves tucked into her waistband, one bare shoulder exposed. Her fingers nervously fidgeted with the edge of her dress as she surveyed the distant horizon. The canyon stretched wide and empty before her. Lozen stood a few paces away, dark hair brushing his shoulders, feathers braided in, muscular frame poised and alert, deerskin trousers and red woven belt illuminated in the dying light. He had spent the day guiding her, watching every misstep, silent and unrelenting. His presence had become a tether she could neither sever nor ignore, and the tension between them pulsed quietly, unspoken yet undeniable. The day had been long, and Rowena felt a mix of fatigue and restless energy. Her pulse thrummed not just from exertion but from awareness, an acute, almost unbearable sense of him. She hated herself for it, hated the way her gaze kept drifting to him, the way her chest constricted when he moved closer than strictly necessary. "Rest," he said quietly, voice low, carrying authority without demand. He had taken the lead since morning, guiding her over rocks, along ridges, across narrow ledges. She wanted to protest, to assert her independence, but the exhaustion in her limbs made her knees ache, and she allowed herself to sink fully onto the rock. Lozen crouched beside her, a mere foot away, dark hair catching the last light, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt visible and vibrant. He didn't touch her. He simply observed, silent, calm, a force that made the space between them crackle. Rowena's fingers twisted in her lace gloves, braid falling in front of her shoulder, dress falling loosely over her form. The desert breeze tugged at her exposed shoulder and she shivered. She hated the vulnerability she felt, the way the space between them, the mere presence of him, could unsettle her entirely. And yet she could not look away, could not deny the way her body responded to the proximity of his form, the subtle strength in the way he moved and watched. A sudden gust of wind blew through the plateau, carrying dust and scrub, brushing Rowena's hair against her face. Instinctively, Lozen moved closer, just enough that the heat of his body brushed hers. She froze, jaw tight, heart racing, and jerked back slightly, but the subtle closeness lingered longer than she wanted. "You're tense," he said softly. Not a question, not a reprimand. Just an observation. His dark eyes held hers, steady and unyielding. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. I'm fine," she replied sharply, though the lie trembled on her lips. She hated how aware she was of him, hated the way her chest fluttered, the way her fingers fidgeted. Yet the truth was undeniable. The tension between them had grown over days, unspoken but thick, curling through the canyon air. Hours passed with the sun sinking below the horizon. Shadows lengthened, and the canyon darkened to deep violet and navy. Rowena's eyelids drooped slightly from fatigue, yet she remained restless, aware of every subtle motion, every unspoken glance. Lozen stayed close, dark hair catching starlight, braided feathers swinging gently, deerskin trousers and red-woven belt taut against his form, every muscle relaxed but ready. And then it happened, an accidental brush of hands as she reached for a rock to steady herself. The contact was brief, electric, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the canyon held its breath. Rowena's cheeks flushed, and she jerked back instinctively, but Lozen's steady gaze followed hers, unwavering, unblinking, and something unspoken passed between them. In a quiet, shared moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. Braid against bare shoulder, corset loosened, lace gloves in her waistband, muscular tension in his arms, deerskin trousers, red-woven belt. The canyon wind whispered around them, and the firelight danced across their figures, casting dramatic, cinematic shadows. She could not look away, could not deny the force drawing her in. The tension coiled tighter, winding around them, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. And in the flicker of the firelight, Rowena felt a heat rise in her chest, a longing she did not understand, a pull that tethered her to him in ways she had never imagined. Night fully claimed the canyon. Rowena leaned back against her rock, braid tumbling over her shoulder, eyes half closed, shoulders bare. Lozen crouched nearby, dark hair falling over his forehead, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red-woven belt framing his poised, muscular form. Their proximity was intoxicating, almost unbearable, and though neither spoke, the air between them crackled with the unspoken promise of intimacy. Rowena closed her eyes, shivering in the cool night air, feeling the heat of his presence without a word, without a touch. And for the first time, she understood that this connection, dangerous, tantalizing, unspoken, could not be denied. The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing across rocks and scrub. The canyon slept, yet they remained wide awake, the tension binding them tightly, quietly, irrevocably. Night had fully fallen over the desert canyon, the sky a deep indigo sprinkled with stars, cold and silent. Rowena huddled against a rock, braid falling over her shoulder, faded dress creased and dusty, corset slightly loosened, lace gloves tucked in her waistband, shoulder bare to the chill. The air was thin, carrying the scent of desert sage and dust, and she shivered, hugging herself tightly. Her pulse raced, not entirely from the cold. Lozen remained nearby, dark hair brushing his shoulders, feathers braided in. Muscular frame relaxed but alert, deerskin trousers and red-woven belt prominent in the firelight. He had been silent for hours, simply observing, watching her movements and the canyon beyond. The tension between them had grown over days, unspoken, electric, impossible to ignore. Rowena shifted slightly, adjusting her braid and smoothing the folds of her dress, trying to focus on the stars above. Yet she felt him, the pull of his presence like a force field, subtle but relentless. Each glance she stole at him made her pulse spike. Every subtle movement of his body drew her attention despite herself. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows across rocks and scrub. Rowena tugged her knees closer, the heat from the flames brushing her skin, her chest tight with a tension she refused to name. Lozen crouched nearby, dark hair catching the light, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red-woven belt emphasizing the strength in his frame. He said nothing, yet the air between them was alive with anticipation, a quiet storm building. As the wind rustled through the canyon, Rowena felt a sudden surge of boldness. She shifted closer to the fire, braid falling forward, shoulder exposed, gloves brushing against her fingers, and she dared to look at him. Their eyes met, the canyon silent except for the fire's crackle. She swallowed hard, heart hammering. Lozen's gaze softened ever so slightly, but his presence remained commanding. Without a word, he moved closer, until the heat from his body brushed hers. Rowena froze, chest tight, instinctively leaning back. But the pull was magnetic, undeniable. Her fingers curled slightly at her waistband, braid slipping over her shoulder, as she fought the urge to recoil and the inexplicable draw toward him at the same time. The moment stretched taut, the world narrowing to firelight, desert wind, the dark canyon, and the charged space between them. Lozen did not touch her, yet every motion, every flicker of his eyes, spoke of a connection she could not deny. And then, quietly, deliberately, their hands brushed again, fingers grazing, holding, lingering just long enough to send a jolt of awareness through her. Rowena's breath caught. She looked away instinctively, face flushed, but her pulse betrayed her. The canyon seemed to shrink, the wind silent, the stars watching, as the tension coiled tighter than ever. Lozen's dark eyes followed her, unwavering, patient, authoritative. His hand hovered close for a heartbeat, then retreated, leaving her restless, aching with awareness of what could be, what simmered beneath the surface. Rowena felt the pull in her chest, impossible to ignore, an awareness of desire tempered by the canyon's silence and the fire's glow. The night deepened. Rowena leaned back against her rock, braid loose, dress dusty, shoulder bare, corset slightly loosened. Lozen crouched nearby, dark hair falling over his forehead, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt marking his form. Silence held, yet it was heavy, electric, intimate without a word. They remained awake, sharing the canyon in quiet intensity, the unspoken tension coiling tight and unrelenting. Somewhere between the stars and the desert wind, Rowena felt the undeniable pull of him. The canyon, the fire, the night. They all faded, leaving only the silent, potent connection between them. The heat of his presence brushed against her awareness, teasing, relentless, impossible to ignore, and for the first time, she did not fight it. She allowed herself to feel the tension, the awareness, the anticipation of a closeness, yet unrealized. The first light of dawn crept over the canyon, painting the rocks in soft pink and gold. Rowena stretched, braid falling messily over one shoulder, faded dress wrinkled and dusty, corset slightly loosened, lace gloves tucked into her waistband, one bare shoulder exposed. Her pulse was still quick from the night's lingering tension, from the awareness of Lozen's presence beside her. She shivered, but not from cold. Her body remembered the heat of proximity, the subtle brush of hands, the intensity of eyes meeting in silence. Lozen stood a short distance away, dark hair brushing his shoulders, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt gleaming faintly in the morning light. His posture was relaxed but ready, eyes scanning the canyon, muscles taut yet controlled. Rowena could feel him even without looking, the magnetic weight of his presence anchoring her in place. The morning was quiet, save for the desert wind and distant cries of birds. They began to move together, navigating the plateau toward the distant ridges. Each step brought them closer, yet neither spoke, the unspoken tension between them wrapping around every glance, every movement. Rowena's braid brushed her shoulder, her gloves fidgeted at her waistband, one shoulder bare, as if the desert itself conspired to expose her vulnerability. At a narrow ridge, her foot slipped on loose rock. Lozen's hand caught hers instinctively, fingers brushing in a brief, lingering touch that made her pulse spike. Their eyes met, hers wide with a mix of fear and something else, his calm and commanding. Rowena's chest heaved, and she realized with a rush that she no longer resisted the pull between them. The canyon stretched endlessly, yet for a moment, it felt like they were alone in a private world. Lozen stepped closer, his breath brushing her hair, and she felt the warmth of his body near hers. Neither spoke, but the quiet understanding passed between them was undeniable. Hands touched again, braid brushing his shoulder, subtle contact building a bridge over the days of silent tension. As the sun rose higher, they reached a secluded alcove, shaded by jagged rocks. Rowena sank onto a flat stone, heart hammering, braid tumbling over her shoulder bare, corset slightly loosened. Lozen crouched beside her, dark hair catching the light, feathers braided in, deerskin trousers and red woven belt marking his powerful frame. Then, in a heartbeat of shared courage and desire, they leaned closer, lips meeting in a soft, lingering kiss. It was tentative at first, a brush of warmth, then deeper, a silent acknowledgement of the tension, longing, and connection that had been building for days. The world around them, the canyon, the wind, the desert sun, faded until there was only this moment, intimate but restrained, mature, meant for the heart rather than the body. When they finally parted, Rowena rested her forehead against his chest, breathing uneven, braid falling over one shoulder, faded dress rumpled, gloves tucked in her waistband, shoulder bare. Lozen's hands rested lightly on her arms, steady, reassuring, dark hair brushing the nape of her neck. Neither spoke, words unnecessary. The canyon, the wind, the plateau, all had borne witness to their silent acknowledgement of desire and connection. The pull, the tension, the stolen touches and fleeting glances had found their resolution in that single, tender moment. They moved together, side by side, hearts still racing, but the fear and restraint replaced with the quiet understanding of mutual acceptance. By midday, Rowena and Lozen were walking through the plateau, closer than ever, no longer avoiding the magnetic force that had drawn them together. The canyon seemed smaller now, the desert less imposing, because they had found each other amid the tension and silent longing. Their hands brushed occasionally, braid falling over her shoulder, gloves in her waistband, shoulder bare, and with each touch, each glance, they acknowledged the slow-burning connection that had matured into something undeniable. They had endured the tension, the restraint, and the silent awareness of desire, and in the canyon, under the endless sky, they moved forward together, finally, irrevocably, bound by a quiet intimacy that promised more than mere survival.